Portuguese is very similar to Spanish. However, there are a few pronunciation and grammatical differences. I think a lot of times Portuguese is a lot more forgiving with placement of words in a sentence than Spanish is. And a lot of people will say that Portuguese sounds like drunken Spanish. I wouldn't say that it sounds drunken, but it definitely is a lot more slurred. In Spanish, you really have to enunciate everything you say. Like, words are just a lot more deliberate. There's a lot more consonant sounds, a lot more very hard sounds. And in Portuguese, there's jus and chus, and there's just lots of slurred sounds. It's a very fluid language. And so people will a lot of times be used to Spanish, and then they'll hear Portuguese and they'll just think that you're drunk, or that you're just not very good at speaking, or that you have some sort of speaking disability. And that's not the case. Portuguese is just a very fluid language. There's some differences between Spanish and Portuguese in grammar. For example, the formal and the informal are switched. So in Spanish, to say informally you use the tu form. In Portuguese, tu is the formal instead of the informal. And so in Portuguese, you really only have to learn 4 tenses instead of 5 or 6 in Spanish, because the you and the plural you form are always spoken in third person. So you only have to learn first and third person verbs, the endings for first and third person verbs. So a second person conjugation is never really used in Portuguese, except for in the scriptures and sometimes in the South. Or if you're just trying to sound sophisticated and have some fun with people. Sometimes I would, just to be fun, speak in the second person, or just speak with some interesting language that I would learn from reading the scriptures, which is a very formal text. And people would stop and be taken aback because they weren't used to hearing that, but it's still correct to be using a second person form. But just in Portuguese, you really only have to learn 4 tenses instead of 6 like you would in Spanish. So to demonstrate a difference between the pronunciation between Spanish and Portuguese, I'll give you an example of how to say the church's name in Spanish, and then do it in Portuguese, just so you can hear the difference in how Spanish is a lot more enunciated and a lot more choppy, and Portuguese is a lot more slurred. So in Spanish, the church's name is La Iglesia de Jesucristo de los Santos de los Últimos Dias. And in Portuguese, it's A Igreja de Jesucristo dos Santos dos Últimos Dias. You see how there's a lot more jus and chus, and it's just a lot more slurred in Portuguese. Whereas in Spanish, it's a little bit more choppy. Even though I was saying it fast, you can tell it's a lot more enunciated, and the syllables that are used are a lot more deliberate. And so I believe that you can speak a little bit faster in Portuguese, just because you don't have to, just because a lot more of the syllables are a lot more slurred. I was excited to learn Portuguese rather than going Spanish speaking, because I can't roll my R's. And in Portuguese, you'd never have to roll your R's. It's great. I was so excited because a double R in Spanish, you have to roll. But in Portuguese, it just makes a sound, like an H. R's a lot of times make H sounds, which flabbergasted me for a minute. And so that was one of the difficulties in learning Portuguese, was just getting the pronunciation down. But really, once I had the rules of pronunciation down, it was a breeze to learn Portuguese, just because for me it was very similar to Spanish, and so I was able to just replace all my Spanish knowledge with Portuguese. And once I had those pronunciation rules down, I was able to just really fly with my language learning.